Sego, Zewagwego, Yan Hodungus, Youngets, Wagatahuni, Tegayan Denega Ganagari, Gayangahaga, and I'm very glad to be here today. And it never really is a chore to talk about Indigenous education. I've been involved in it in from different perspectives, but it really is all interconnected. So I'm really glad to be able to come back and share some information on that for your members. My name is Yan Hodungus. I'm at the Ontario Literacy Coalition and First Nations House at Toronto U, and that's my contact email should you have any questions after. So our topic today is about inclusive education and teaching and learning with Indigenous content and methodologies. So to get started with that, let me see. I just really wanted to say welcome. Sego is in the Mohawk language. Ani is Anishinaabe. Gwe is Mi'kmaq. And Dossi is Cree. So just a bit on that. What we're going to be talking about today, I'm just going to go through a bit of a historical reflection on education and then talk a bit about the Western education system, the public education system as we know it, and a bit on the Indigenous education system. And then I'll be talking about integrating for a more inclusive system between the both of looking at Indigenous content and methodologies, Indigenous pedagogy, in other words. And then we'll have a group exercise towards the end, and we'll come back and share a bit on that and have any question and answers. So that's kind of what we'll be looking at today. Of course, before we get started, I'm from the Haudenosaunee traditional community, and it's part of our teachings that at every opportunity, we honor all those entities of creation that are continuing to do what they were created to do. And they were all created to sustain the human being. So along with this is the land acknowledgement, Mother Earth, that gives forth everything and supports everything that sustains the human being, the natural world. But first of all, I really do want to acknowledge those that we've lost and those that are continuing to suffer during this pandemic. So acknowledgement to those, as well as that acknowledgement to the natural world. Like I say, everything that sprouts from Mother Earth, in that it's the waters and it's the medicines and it's the trees and it's the animals, the plant world, as we go up in creation, right up to, we know that the sun has a major role in our well-being, as well as Grandma Moon has regulating all women of, on Earth with childbearing and those aspects. So everything is interrelated, and our relationship we believe, is something to be honored and acknowledged whenever we get together and have opportunity to do that, because the natural world is struggling just as a human being is struggling in today's society. Being from around the Toronto area, or even any area throughout, it's always important for the land acknowledgement from wherever you are. I know people are from across Canada here, Alberta and other parts of the country, but to take that moment to acknowledge the land that has been preserved for the use of peoples from all parts of the globe today, to come and share in the resources that have been preserved by the Indigenous peoples wherever you're at. But specifically in Toronto, there is a treaty long existent before the settlers came, which is called the Dish with One Spoon wampum. And the wampum just simply means this is a picture of it, and the story that goes is that this white part for Southern Ontario specifically is all of where people can live. But in the idea then is that there is one dish with all the resources put in it. So we each have a role to play in that preservation for the fact that we share with each other, but also too, there's enough resources left in there for the generations to come. So that's a reminder of the treaty that does still exist, is in existence today between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. So that's a bit of a Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving, and to get things started and to put our mind in a good space as we start out. So looking at it from a historical aspect, we really do have to ask the question of what is education anyway? You know, we use that term all the time about education and a system, changing it up. It's argued over, it's planned, everything like that. But in that question, what is an education? What is education? Education is a system that is created by a society to perpetuate its way of life. So in Canada, in this Canada, as it was being built, in the 1800s, under federal and provincial legislation, as that developed totally across the country, as we know it today, it was a process of colonization. Colonization means that there were development of federal and provincial legislations that pertained carte blanche, like blanketed everyone in the country that was living here. So what happened with that is that the colonization, as it developed, was something that was also applied to the Indigenous nations that already were in existence for thousands and thousands of years here in this Canada, as it was starting to be developed by the settlers, who in essence, by their education system, wanted to create and perpetuate a society that would benefit their way of life. So that's to say that we also need to recognize at the same time, I'm from the Mohawk Nation, there's, Ojibwe Nation, Blackfoot Nation, Haida Nation, Mi'kmaq Nation, all across the country. We were societies unto ourselves for thousands and thousands of years, and we actually had our own education systems to perpetuate our way of life. But that's where we talk about that colonization that just overrode anything that was already here. So it ended up not being that beneficial for Indigenous peoples, whereas it was the way to go for the development of this Canada. So for starters, that's the idea of the education system that we're working with. So as a result of that happening, we have to ask ourselves, what culture did that education system, the colonized education system, what culture does it perpetuate for the peoples? And what values does it perpetuate in that education system? As well as whose information does it perpetuate? So those are the questions that kind of rear out of the idea of an Canadian education system. So of course, the goal of that education system was in the making of a good Canadian citizen that will perpetuate the Canadian way of life. So that's the ultimate goal, in that education in itself is federally legislated, and filters down into each provincial way of doing. So when we look at that Western education system, some of the identifying factors of it is that it really is a linear process, in that even within our curriculums or our projects or anything that we do, there is always a start and an end. And it's set on a timeline. Lots of times I know that the experience I had in the Western education system when my children were young was the fact that things were started, but if they didn't finish their project or finish their stories or finish whatever was worked, the time came to an end and it was just an end. Things were left undone. So it was just that. There was a start and there was an end to the whole year, but also to each of the subject areas. And with that, the idea of the different subject areas was more or less a boutique of information, each with its own skills and tools that came with each of the subject areas. So that really what's happening is there is a fragmented learning process because there's a start and an end in certain aspects of boutiques of information. That ends up being a fragmented learning process, generally what is acceptable to the system of you and how well you know that. And also, too, what arrives out of that is a lot of questions from the learners as to why is this important? Why do I need to know this? So there's a lot of questions left as well from the fragmented way of learning. So in the Indigenous education system, however, it's more of a circular process, and there's spirals on a circular way of doing things and sharing information, in that when you come to the end of the circle, it doesn't stop there. It goes on and expands into scope and depth of information that continues to pertain. And it's continuous. The education, the information is continuous, and there's lifelong learning over the process. So you take what you learn, say, from a kindergarten primary, is expanded into, the mid schools and senior grades. So that also, too, within Indigenous education, there's more of a holistic learning process. So it isn't just a matter of getting this information and being tested on it as to how much you know or understand. It's a holistic process of, there's the mental component of gathering this information, but also there's a thinking process of, well, what do you feel about that? Or how does that make you feel? So in that learning process, there's an understanding, more of an understanding about the information, but also too, we have opportunity to apply that information to see how it works. So they have opportunity for continued questioning on that. So those are, kind of the overall general comparisons from the two education systems. So what was happening then as we developed over the education system, I would recommend that anyone, I really, really believe today, in today's teacher education system, that every teacher, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, should read this Indian Control of Indian Education document, which was tabled in 1973. It is from this document that Indigenous educators from across Canada developed this policy of how Indigenous people were going to take control of their own education, and some of the demands they were making since the early 60s of what needed to go into an education system, and I guess almost the continual asking of, can we just educate our own people so that they're learning what they need to learn, but at the same time it's a different way of learning, because by this time we were having such high dropout rates. Nobody wanted to go to school because it was totally irrelevant. But this Indian control of Indian education is basically the principles upon which the Indigenous education system now operate. This document, 1973 document, was again reviewed in 2010 by the Assembly of First Nation and was totally ratified again as the way to go. So these are very important documents for Indigenous education, and are just as important when you're looking at integrating Indigenous information into mainstream education. And when we look back on putting terminology to things, when we look back on the decolonizing process, probably began in the 1970s and 1980s, where there was just the demands for a change. But now we're calling it is called a decolonizing process, and that just means relearning things that was lost, relearning it in an education system, but the sharing of the knowledge from the community people. So this idea of indigenizing the curriculum and integrating Indigenous information, Indigenous knowledge, would then become transforming not only for the Indigenous student, but for all students, as there was more to it than what was being taught. So this here's kind of an equation that really I have posted. This is kind of what I would say is the framework of Indigenous education, is the fact that we not only provide information, which is data and facts, but we also include some what's being done with this information, show how it is important, see where it fits in, so that students gain an experience of working with this information. And once you have information and some experience in doing things, you're able to talk about it. You have knowledge of that and how it works. So you have an understanding or a knowing of that. One simple aspect of this is some information like an experience plays a major role in bringing things home to us for understanding. So kind of like the example of this I use a lots of times is how many of us can remember being in grade 4 or 5 and going on that school trip. We can immediately remember that school trip. But if asked what was on your history test in grade 4, you're pretty hard pressed to remember that. But your experience of going on a school trip comes immediately to mind because you had some information about that, you experienced it, so you know about that and you can talk about it. So Indigenous education, land is declared by our elders, is land is our first teacher. Go out on the land, play on it, see what's happening, watch the nature around you. So this here idea is now beginning to take hold in mainstream education, land-based education. So this here's a quick look at the holistic aspect of education system. Whatever's being taught or over the course of time, whether it's a unit or whatever, these aspects of the self, it's not only about mental intake of information, but also to physically getting outside or whatever, being able to work with that. Also to how do you feel about that? Dissecting biology. A lot of people are emotionally caught up in dissecting in biology even. So that kind of thing always balance out. And the spiritual part of that is not necessarily or in a religious sense. It just simply means a relationship with the natural world or other people or in the ideas of what you're doing. Yeah, so the quadrants outside are some of the aspects that you can mentally in your planning think about, the workload that's put to this and whether this is inside or outside or where is this taking place. Again, emotional is the information I'm presenting, sparking emotional feelings from the diversity of the peoples in my classroom. And the relationship, yeah, building those relationships with the natural world even. So those are aspects that are looked at in Indigenous education. This is indigenizing the curriculum. So integrating Indigenous knowledge, and a lot of people are not sure what Indigenous knowledge is, or all of a sudden it's ruled out and it's a scary place to go as a teacher of um, uh, am I going to do it justice or should I be doing this? And all these questions come up. But the idea of integrating Indigenous knowledge simply means integrating Indigenous information from an Indigenous perspective, or what do Indigenous people say about this subject area that I'm dealing with? So it's not really that scary, and it doesn't have to be all that much that, it turns out you have to kind of throw out all your curriculum and start again. But it's take what you have and what's the other side of the story that I could add in here. So Indigenous content, Indigenous knowledge, the idea that I can use some appropriate resources. In Indigenous education, the idea of human resources is quite major in that of sharing information in the classroom. And in Indigenous education, there's programs of elders in the classroom, the presence of elders, storytelling, and things like that. Also, too, using cultural frameworks like that medicine wheel that I just showed you, that idea of, let me go back there a bit, that idea that it's an Anishinaabe tool, this medicine wheel of a tool, but it also, on this, I have the different quadrants of the self, but this here also can be used for, say, weeks of the month. So this week I'm going to do this week I'm going to do this week I'm going to do this, and we're going to wrap it up. So you see how that idea, so, or it can be your 4 months of a semester. So it's simply a tool for learning. It's a learning tool. So it's a cultural framework or a template to use other than the regular lesson planning. So it's an Indigenous way of looking at developing information and curriculum. So these also can be theme-based units that you develop, even if it is on that medicine wheel process. Hands-on projects along the way. Hands-on projects can take the role of many different subject areas. For fact, we're working on it, but we're also writing about it. Some students might talk orally about it, presentations, those kinds of things. Land-based curriculum, place-based curriculum is now becoming a thing in our curriculum way of doing. In fact, that we're doing more outside activities simply because of being able to distance ourselves from each other. There's other information that can go in here. we're all about music and literature. So we have, of the past 30 years, an increase in all of our Indigenous authors and musicians. There's all kinds of legends and storytelling that's going on. Indigenous heroes and historical figures. There's very, in all of the subject areas, there's noted Indigenous peoples that can be talked about, as well as mainstream peoples as well. Riel, Elijah Harper, Norva Morso, even Ted Nolan. The ideas of providing all students with something, information on some Indigenous heroes and what they have do in their contributions to society. So Indigenous literature, a lot of Indigenous literature is available, and what comes to mind is a distributor called goodminds.com, in which they review all of the Indigenous materials, and is classified in age groups and subject areas. So I just wanted to add that, to have a look at that, of an example of things that are available. Going on, talking about indigenizing indigenizing our instruction, our Indigenous pedagogy, the science of teaching. So simply put, that's just having a look at indigenizing our ways of doing things. So like I was talking about, there's experiential learning, that what is something basic to the Indigenous education system and is new to the mainstream education, experiential learning, versus just simply information gathering or lectures of information. This is what you need to know, study it, and I'll test you. But the idea of experience in learning. Cooperative education in Indigenous education is a major activity, because there's always teamwork and group work. Indigenous people were, I guess, instinctively were communal people anyway, in that they supported each other and helped each other learn and grow and share. So cooperative learning is a good way to go or practice in education systems. Also, to the inclusion of language and culture is always in utmost, whether it's very minimal or the fact that it is there. So if you provide some Indigenous information, it's for sure it takes on the more cultural aspect of things. As we say, human resources to the classroom to share in instruction, role modeling. They show how to do, and they tell stories of how to do. So they're keepers of the knowledge, not necessarily elders, but there are knowledge people that have their human resources, but their area of expertise is far and wide. So they don't necessarily also always have to be an elder. It could be somebody's parents. They're a carver, or they make snowshoes or whatever. Just to come in and talk about that. That's new to the learning of everyone. So also to the idea, one of the pedagogies or ways of doing is sharing circles or talking circles of sets up really protocols and practices on ways of doing, and has taken over many classrooms, been added notes to classes to start out your week, to share. Let students get things off their chest, what happened on the weekend, or they're excited about something coming to school, and if they never have opportunity to share that with students, or the other students coming to realize kind of where they're at this week, and things that might be bothering them. become very important to the dynamics of your classroom. And these can still be done, a lot of these things can still be done in the virtual classroom. And we'll talk about that later. So Indigenous pedagogy and ways of doing and ways of setting things up so that there's a learning advantage by all students. One of the things that's talked about specifically are the 4 R's, which are doing things respectfully with the information that you have, using materials respectively. Relevance is what I'm teaching relevant. Are my examples relevant? Is this respectful and relevant to those diversity of people that are in my classroom? Have I set my lessons up so that they have opportunity to learn from each other as well? Reciprocity and responsibility, I guess, is the instructor responsibility in that. I guess the protocols and practices and our ways of doing are done respectfully as well, carried out with that same respect. Also, too, when you're setting up your instruction or your lessons, it's really important to teach to the 5 senses. Even in a lot of the lessons that you're teaching now, give them quick thought to think, what senses am I touching on when I deliver this material? Right now, a lot of it is visual. They're hearing it, but also too, how are they having opportunity to taste things or smell things or feel things? What has come important of late too are the 9 multiple intelligences that are there, so that not the understanding that not every student learns the same way. Some might be musical, some really do benefit from sitting still and listening to information. Some have to be up walking around. We think they're not paying attention, but they are. And I think the 9th multiple intelligence that was added was a naturalistic, get outside intelligence. So something worth looking at. And land-based learning, of course, we hear a lot about that, ground-based learning of moving to the outside and taking advantage of that. So indigenizing the classroom, inside and outside the environment. Basically, what we're looking at is just creating a comfortable, safe learning environment for our students. And this can be done on in the virtual classroom. But going back to school, that idea of recognizing and respecting the diversity of the students in our class. With that knowledge of the diversity of the students, what do you have in your classroom that reflects or brings a comfort level to any one of those students? Display of symbols, their artwork, any kind of artifacts are around, flags, even pictures of flags, those kinds of things that the diverse students are able to relate to in the classroom while they're there. And the idea of celebrating the learner, display their work and events involved in. Once we're back in now, what has come into play in the virtual classroom, being able to find a living area in the home of that's conducive to learning, those kinds of things. But also too, the classroom arrangements now are geared, going back into this during this pandemic, is separation and being distancing yourself. So again, a classroom arrangement takes on many different aspects. So outside the classroom, even still going back, there's sitting in your classrooms, your seats, but also to getting out and walking and being able to explore certain things, answering questions for themselves. The idea that Also, too, you can bring life into the classroom, bring the outside in, maybe they have plants they want to bring from home, small plants, and we watch it grow. Fish tank, going and wandering outside and bringing things in, the leaves or anything like that. So we can work together to bring the outside in the classroom. So those are some of the, not all, but a quick overview of being able to bring information into the work as teachers and educators, administrators of areas that you would like to see developed in your education systems, regardless of where you work. I think this idea then of our goal today, as opposed to colonization, throughout the last couple of hundred years, is the goal today, as of 2015, is more of a reflection from the Truth and Reconciliation call to action. And one specific call in there is this reconciliation of education. So from 2015, especially in Ontario, and I'm sorry, and I'm sure across the country, systems of education have worked to kind of open up and integrate the best they can with the tools that they have to get a more inclusive education system happening in their midst. So basically, it says a foundation in integrated education for a more inclusive education to benefit all peoples in Canada going forward. So this is an idea of you hear a lot of arguments that, especially for integrating Indigenous information, is the fact that, well, I don't have any Indigenous people in my class. So take it from there that Indigenous information is only important to Indigenous people. But according to the Truth and Reconciliation, is that every person and every learner in Canada would benefit from hearing about Indigenous information so that they know growing up that there's another side to the coin, or their information that they have is expanded to include that Indigenous information, which may largely be relevant to work they're going to do down the road. So what we become then is not an instructor or a teacher per se of just delivering information. We try to become more of a learning facilitator for the benefit of all the students, hopefully being able to answer, or they can answer each other questions. So that kind of looking at the goals in education today are starting to shift, certainly. So before I get into the exercise, I don't know, Suzanne, if there are any questions that have come up or not. Might pause for a bit.
Thank you, Bonnie Jane. That was a lot of wonderful information, and there was some discussion on the chat about different resources, including one that Michelle Bro mentioned, which she got at goodmind.ca, which was it was one that people were recommending. Michelle, do you want to unmute yourself and just share that one? And then there was a question about whether something like this existed in French, but maybe you could tell us what you found was helpful in that one.
So this is the book I'm referring to. It's called This Place, 150 Years Retold. I only picked it up out of personal interest because I wanted to further educate myself about Indigenous perspectives on our settlers nation of Canada. So I wanted to learn that way. I was quite surprised when I received it that it's set up in comic book style. But there's multiple authors, Indigenous authors throughout, and goodminds.ca was really, really helpful in finding resources, even just for a novice like myself. So I would certainly recommend reaching out to them if people of French language background want to find suitable resources as well.
Somebody just said it might be goodminds.com, not .ca is the link.
Yeah.
So just
Sure.
so
Yeah,
people can find it easily. And for the person who was looking for French resources, Michelle, you were saying that possibly they could guide you as well to an appropriate resource in French, because I do think that there's so much kind of groundwork that we all need to do personally. I know we're all on our own learning journey, myself very much included in that. And so trying to figure out the right resources and where some of our own gaps are is really, really helpful. We're going to be moving into some small groups to do a kind of an activity in small groups. But before we do, you can post a question in the chat or unmute yourself and ask a question if you have one, or make a comment. Maureen Wainwright, I saw your comment, which was that, all people become richer by experiencing and understanding Indigenous ways of knowledge. So it's something that enriches all of us, which I think is a really, really important point. Welcome back, everyone. I know sometimes it feels like we got time traveled back to the big group and we were in the middle of a sentence or something. So apologies if you were right in the middle of something. These are some of the pros and cons of these breakout sessions, but I know we were in the middle of a very interesting discussion in the group I was in, and we might have a chance to share some of that, but Bonnie Jane, I don't know if the group you were in wanted to share a little bit about how you approach that at all.
Joanne, if she wanted to give any concluding thoughts, or even Brian.
There's some good conversation. I think the nugget for me was that small adaptations continuously applied can make a big difference. It doesn't have to be a wild, radical rethink of the way that the classroom environment is happening or feels like, but small, consistent things over time can make a difference. So that was great to hear from Bonnie.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I don't know if anybody else had anything to add. Yeah, and I think that was kind of the nugget was, don't try to throw out everything that you're doing or think you have to and worry that now you got to start all over again. It's the fact that just review what you've got and see where you can kind of change things with pictures or, little video clips or just kind of here and there over the course of time. Will certainly create that awareness of information that you're trying to share. So that's kind of what came out of our group.
That's great. And Brian actually asked a question about whether you have a favorite resource to recommend, or we could send it later, that would help instructors and facilitators to create a safe, welcoming, and inclusive space for Indigenous learners. Is there something that...
I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, and I know that the Ontario Native Literacy Coalition has created a number of resources as well that we could maybe take a look at. So maybe what we'll do is afterwards we'll kind of follow up with Bonnie Jane and see if we could maybe come up with a list of corollary resources that might be helpful for further exploration and deepening in terms of your practice and how you're approaching it. That would be great. I just wondered if sorry, did you want to say something, Bonnie Jane?
No. I'm just thank everybody for that, because it might be something, it might be a gap that we can put together and help everybody with. Yeah, thanks.
I wanted, and somebody's shared a resource from Alberta that would be great. And Bonnie, if you could put your email into the chat, that would be great. Somebody's just asked for that. I'm going to actually ask, I don't know if Jill is still on this or not, but Jill was in our group and had some really interesting things to say about how we would approach even a discussion. These are with children, I believe, because I came in late to the conversation, but it was the whole idea of how you would even approach, say, a biology lesson talking about a rabbit. And it was very interesting in terms of the broader context using some of these Indigenous principles. Jill, are you still on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, would you mind sharing a little bit about what you said in our group to the bigger group?
About what part? Like,
Just about how you would give thanks for the animal and where you would
oh
get it
yes,
and all of
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm an Indigenous person, Denada First Nation from Northern Alberta. So I was thinking about it and I thought, how would you put this into a lesson plan? And one of the ladies came up with it. I thought that was a great idea, how she was able to incorporate it into one of her studies. So in her class, for her class, then we talked about how could go out to the bush, like I'd set a how the way my grandmother and I would go out to the bush, and then we'd set a rabbit snare, and then she catches a rabbit and we bring it back. But then at the time is when we're there, it's just giving thanks for this rabbit that had offered its life, had given its life, or had, I don't know how to say it in words, because I have a First Nation language and I have to interpret this into English, right? So I'm thinking through it, and it has to give thanks, to be grateful, to give gratitude for this animal that, the rabbit that had given its life to us in order to eat and to stay alive, literally, kind of thing. So and then it was just going through that, and I was thinking, what if we put it into a classroom, but then the kids were going to start saying, oh, this is so soft, and don't give it names, because I know when you give an animal name, then it becomes an emotional attachment. So, and it's like, don't give it names, like, and then I guess go through the myths of all these Peter rabbits and how to make it okay, so that there's Bugs Bunny out there, and how to make it for the kids to feel like it's okay to go and eat this rabbit. And that's when the naming of the parts and everything would come in, and what we would do with the rabbit skin. My grandma makes it into moccasins, like slippers, and so it's or even a blanket. I heard that they used to use it for blankets. So it was, so everything of the rabbit was used. I even kept the rabbit foot, because we ended up learning later on it's good luck from the Western culture, but not from ours, where we just kept it because I got to find out the story behind it. And then there's creation stories too, right? So how did the rabbit come to be? And was there shapeshifters around it? That's what I'm seeking right now, is those are legends, so that it can be shared with the kids. So that was a lot.
Yes, thank you so much, Jill. That was a very, very rich discussion, and amazing
Yeah.
to hear that whole perspective that brought so much depth and breadth to something that might have been approached without that perspective in a very different way. So I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that. That was amazing. So we haven't heard from all the other groups yet. I'm just wondering if another group wanted to share some of the highlights of your conversation, because each one was very different. Kim from group 1, go ahead.
Hi. We talked a lot about how difficult it would be to teach Indigenous content to learners of English as a first language. We had several people in our group who taught ESL. So we were talking about that quite a bit towards the end, because I think 4 or 5 members of our group were teaching English as a second language to adult students. So we had some discussion about that, because I was telling a story about when I had taught drum making to Indigenous students at one point, and then I can't remember the lady's name, but she said, well, I would have to start with what is a drum to my students. So that led into how difficult it would be to teach lessons to English as a second language students.
Kim, somebody put in the chat that experiential, learning would be very helpful possibly with that type of a group of learners.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Experiential activities. And then Anita wrote, as a settler, would you recommend that I work with an elder on such lessons? Are there protocols surrounding this for settlers? And I think that's an excellent question, because I think if we are not Indigenous ourselves, sometimes we feel reticent to jump into something that feels not from our teachings and world, and yet it feels very important to include. So Bonnie Jane, I'm just going to ask you quickly, and then I want to come back to Kim. How would you handle that as a teacher, as a settler teacher?
I would think certainly if there's somebody in your school or your organization as an elder, or a friend of a friend, but if you could find that information by talking to an elder and feel more comfortable about that. But also too, you can download what it is you're looking for from Google or YouTube, or normally there's some kind of explanation for that. And from that, you can glean what you want to teach from that. So it's not like you're stepping on toes with something that you're learning already that has been explained. So,
right.
Yeah, really, I think because it's the new frontier in education with Indigenous information, that people are sometimes reluctant of separating the sacred information from, just information on certain things, appropriation of certain things. But certainly if it's information and sharing information and symbols, like even if you are talking about the drum, at least show pictures of this is what we're talking. This is what we're talking about. The pictures, you're not certainly encroaching on anything by that of sharing the information that today this is still used, or if you are trying to explain things in English, that the pictures that you're showing are Indigenous pictures or Indigenous symbols or things like that, it's not always, straight across the board of, because we're talking in English, it has to reflect everything in English. So you can kind of create that too. It's not, so that's where I say tidbits of information, non-intrusive, but integrated to some degree. But it doesn't take over the conversation, but it enhances the conversations that you're having for your learners.
Thank you. I just want to go back to Kim, because I think you maybe had another point you wanted to make. Did you?
Yeah, and then near the end, we were talking about, how important it was that we all felt that everyone in Canada should know the importance of what a drum is, and not just newcomers to Canada, but all Canadians. And, I said, not just Indigenous people, but everyone. And, if you ask a lot of people my age, they don't even know why a drum is important. And because we didn't learn it in school, it wasn't in the curriculum. It wasn't. The only reason I know that is because I've learned it through what I teach now, right? It's not because I learned it through what I was taught growing up. I wasn't taught that in the books that the teacher was teaching me. It wasn't in the curriculum. So, that's exactly what Bonnie is saying. It should be in the curriculum.
Right.
And everyone should know that. We all should know why a drum is important to in the Indigenous culture. And it's a shame that we don't all know that.
Mhm.
And it's partly the government's fault because it's not in there. It's partly, personal responsibility. It's a combination of both, I guess. And I'm taking my part in educating myself because I feel like it partly, it's individual accountability, right? Like I have to do my part in educating myself, and the information's out there, so it's available for me to read it. So I'm going to read it.
That's such an
Because
important point.
as a Canadian, that's my, I feel that that's my obligation to do, or that's what I need to do. I need to educate myself.
Kim, I'm sorry,
because-
I'm gonna have to move to the next group just because I'm looking at the
Yeah.
time and we only have just a few minutes, but that was such an important point. And it's all that
Yeah.
idea of taking personal responsibility, both
Yeah.
as educators and as learners, because we're all
Yeah.
very much on a learning curve. So thank you for making that really important point. And I'm just gonna turn to Maureen, who wanted to share
Okay.
from group 4.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim.
Okay.
Yeah, so group 4 was really on task. Parazu came in. Parazu is from Pekanchkim. It's a fly-in community
Nice.
in Northern
Yeah.
Ontario. And she had an idea, and Julie stepped right up and she typed it all up. She was like right on the ball. Like we were on fire. I don't know if Julie can share the lesson plan with you, but I have it on my phone, so I'm going to read off some of the things. We did storytelling, language arts, storytelling, a grade 3-4. Our introductory activity was going to be having an elder come in and talk about story, sharing the traditions and the cultural lessons and teaching. Different communities will have different protocols. There is the protocol of respecting the visitor, paying attention, that kind of thing. We talked about storytelling. I had learned that storytelling was something that you did in the winter. Other people were sharing that storytelling, that different stories are told at during different seasons. Oops, I lost where I was. We talked about having a post-visit activity where students could be invited to go and talk to an elder. Maybe if it was a community of students that didn't have a lot of Indigenous elders to speak to, they could speak just to their grandparents. Or if it was a community where there were more elders, they could go and speak to Indigenous elders. We talked about respecting traditions when certain stories are told, respecting our elders. We didn't get all the way through it, but I thought we were quite on fire.
That's impressive.
One of the Parazu got us started, and Julie, I must say, was right on top of typing it out. One of the things that came up was that different communities will need different things. I talked about having tea and cookies, for instance, for the celebration, and then other people were saying, well, in their school board, they weren't allowed to have sugary snacks. And I was saying, well, so it'd have to be modified. Also, some people sort of indicated that in their school board, they'd have to be tying into a specific expectation in the curriculum, whereas some of us up north or with more Indigenous, with experience with more Indigenous settings, we're more open to sort of letting it flow. And then there was a person in our group that was an adult educator, and he was talking about how he could make it work for his students. So yeah, so we were just we tried to bring everything together, but then near the end we were thinking there's more exceptions to the rule than there. But anyway, that was us.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Maureen. That was awesome. And I think like what you did was you got some really guiding principles that are there. And then realize that everybody's coming from diverse places, but there's still some kind of foundational pieces that you can work around and you can adapt and you can kind of, you know, figure out. So I think that that's amazing, and I'm impressed by your staying on task. That was not every group, but every group had a very rich discussion, and I think that's what's so interesting.